Welcome back, y'all, to another episode of General Ed Kids Deserve Geography 2. If you've been following the TikTok, you saw we finally moved into Central America, where we did physical geography last time, again, according to high school Georgia standards. And now we're taking our deep dive. We're moving on to Central America, where in my lessons I focus on El Salvador and the number of issues that often go with it. I'm joined today by a very special guest, journalist Daniel Alvarenga. Daniel is the child of Salvadorian refugees and immigrants. He has previously worked for AJ Plus, which is a part of Al Jazeera, Radar, which is a program of Telemundo, as well as bylines in Washington Post and Rolling Stone. Daniel can also be found holding semi-regular Twitter spaces, countering the disinformation of the Nayib Bukele administration regarding police violence, gangs, gentrification, Bitcoin, and all-around growing authoritarian powers, which are all things we love to talk about on here. In focusing on El Salvador and high school geography curriculum regarding human and economic geography, I mentioned why I asked you to come on. Is your work really seems like the appropriate evolution of what needs to be talked about next. Oftentimes when El Salvador comes up in American media, it's gangs, highest homicide rate in the world, Bitcoin, and always from the Bitcoiner bros. And really the necessary evolution of what needs to be taught in the classrooms about what happens next. As well as, we're here outside Atlanta, Georgia, both the new and the long-standing relationships between the state of Georgia, the city of Atlanta, and El Salvador, and how that impacts people's economies and cultures. And that's what we're talking about today, y'all. You have anything to throw in on that before we get rolling?
No, just thank you for having me. Thank you for thinking of me and my work, and talking about El Salvador and how it sort of relates to like our world, our hemisphere, as people in the United States. I feel like there's an interconnectedness there that often gets sort of lost in the shuffle of the news cycle and the demonization of people from El Salvador as well.
Yes, and to add on top of that, how much of, when I've been doing my reading and my homework, how much of a product of the American school system I am, especially here on the East, growing up in the East Coast of America, I realized I was like, damn, I know nothing, and how much of the conversation just doesn't happen at all. Maybe a fair bit's changed, since we were in school, but it's definitely a thing, the Latin American history, and really has very particular, if not limited, presentations in our school system. So I was going to open... Go ahead.
No, I totally agree with you.
So I was going to open with, there's a great number of things to talk about today regarding the Salvadorian ambassador's recent visit to the city of Atlanta. I'll bring it up here. I'm going to do a little share screen action. Let's see. What are we doing? Oh, let me close my email there. Don't need nobody to see that. Window, entire screen, Chrome tab. Here we are. So I'll just leave this up for a moment here on Global Atlanta. El Salvador sells its national rebranding in Atlanta with ambassador visits. Isn't that always the thing there? Rebranding. Has anything changed at all other than the name? And the article talks about, business sort of opportunities and development and shared development, those sorts of things, especially around policing and the relationship between capital and expanding capital endeavors, and how that requires policing and how policing is a huge proliferator of that. You've done a fair bit of work or have had things to say about the School of the Americas, yes?
Yes, absolutely. This, for one, I want to address this picture. El Salvador sells its national rebranding in Atlanta. I don't know why an ambassador is making a visit to Atlanta. Not that Atlanta's not like an important and vibrant place, but one thing to note about this administration under President Nayib Bukele, which is the current president of El Salvador, they're not really welcome by the Biden administration, in the sense that like they've tried to meet with the Biden administration here in DC, where I'm located, and they've just sort of kind of had the door shut on them. The Nayib Bukele administration has been historically friendly to the Trump administration. So when that switch of power happened from Trump to Biden, they lost a lot of favor. And on top of that, the human rights allegations going on in the country in the gang war. So it makes sense that they're going to Atlanta in a weird way because of Cop City and how Cop City sort of aligns with the goals of sort of the right wing authoritarian. We can call it a dictatorship. I would call it a dictatorship in El Salvador, and we could get into why. But the School of the Americas, so Cop City is in Georgia. The School of the Americas was in Fort Benning, Georgia, and it's still there. It's not called School of the Americas. It's called WHINSEC. Let me see if I can pull up the note I have.
Western Hemisphere Institute for National Security and Economic Cooperation. I got it. Something like that.
Yeah. So the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, WHINSEC, which is like, sounds even creepier, but the School of the Americas was essentially, for the last century, a training ground for the leaders of the Western Hemisphere, for the militaries of the Western Hemisphere in the Caribbean and Latin America. And with El Salvador and other countries in Central America that experienced wars, so Guatemala, Nicaragua, that was the training grounds for counterinsurgency against communist forces, against guerrilla forces, and against activism and against any resistance. You didn't have to be a communist to be killed. You just had to be sort of thought of as one by the Salvadoran state in the 80s. So what that ended up looking like for El Salvador was 75. This is a conservative number according to the United Nations Truth Commission on the War of El Salvador, which was done in the 8 months after our war ended. So for backtrack, El Salvador had a war from 1980 to 1992. In that year, my family migrated and millions of Salvadorans were displaced, many coming to the United States, probably why there's Salvadorans in whatever part of the country anyone who's listening find themselves in. But that being said, it caused a lot of death and destruction and displacement, and the conservative estimates from the peace accord say that 75,000 to 80,000 people were killed, and the number of disappearances is probably pretty high as well. But another important note in that UN Truth Commission was that around 80 to 90% of the human rights atrocities happened by the government forces, the United States sponsored El Salvador government forces, meaning that during the Reagan administration, the war was started in Carter's administration, but it really ramped up during Reagan's administration, and it got to the point where Reagan was giving El Salvador's military government the tune of $1 million a day to fight communist rebel warriors, two of which were my mom's brothers. She lost two brothers in the resistance to El Salvador's dictatorship. And just for transparency, my father's family tended to be on the conservative side of that. So the war in El Salvador is very much present in me and in my story, but it also has to do with what's going on now in El Salvador. And so the School of the Americas trained the Salvadoran government, and it was, U.S. taxpayer money, on counterinsurgency tactics against protesters and stuff like that. And you see that those are the kind of things that they're trying to do with Cop City, except Cop City is a more of a domestic thing than an international thing. But, one can say this is like U.S. Imperialism sort of coming home to roost in a way.
It always does. Would you say then, is Bukele, or at least his crew, is this an evolution of what came out of the 80s and 90s? Is he the sort of natural sort of progression of that?
He's not. He's a cautionary tale, I guess, in the sense of this is what happens. I guess it's a natural progression of this is what happens when people forget where they came from, when they forget their struggle. When they forget their historic memory. I think right now in El Salvador there's a big struggle for what we call la memoria histórica, or the historic memory, specifically as it relates to our times under dictatorship, and specifically the war, which is in recent memory. For example, there's a massacre at Mosote. It's the biggest massacre in modern Latin American history, where a whole village was white scorched earth tactic, and the United States government was aware of it and assessed it as well, and tried to cover it up because it made them look bad. So in this war, it affected Salvadorans profoundly, and it was like brother against brother, cousin against cousin at some point, but it was like one side was a communist Marxist insurgency, trying to free the people from what we called the 13 families. There was a little bit more than 13 families, but essentially El Salvador was ruled by a small oligarchy that was good for United States business interests. So the United States was very much trying to keep them in power, and that just goes for the whole region. You can't talk about El Salvador without talking about 1950s Guatemala, where the United Fruit Company, basically with the help of the United States government, the United Fruit Company started a coup in Guatemala that essentially, the domino effect of that coup in Guatemala ended up with a war in El Salvador a couple decades later. So El Salvador didn't happen in a vacuum; it happened in this whole destabilization of the region, and I would say not just Central America, but Latin America and the Caribbean as well. And we can say the global South and talk about all the decolonial solidarities. But yes, so through this war, there was two factions: the right-wing oligarchy, Arena. They were the Death Squad party, the fascist party, and then you had Marxist insurgents on the other side, and that was basically the El Salvador version of Republican Democrats for a long time. Really intense contrast. It would even be insult to call them Democrats and Republicans in the sense that the FMLN wasn't like Democrats. They had a Marxist sort of background, and they fought during the war. And then you had the Arena party, the traditional right-wing Death party, and Nayib Bukele came at a time when Arena party had spent almost 30 years in power, and the FMLN had spent 10 years in power. So people were sort of really polarized because of what camp their family was, or they were during the war. That kind of persisted for 30 years. So Nayib Bukele took advantage of this and was like, okay, well, I'm going to be this third new option, and we're finally going to get over the war. So he was playing on people's sort of sense of being tired of this polarity, being tired of this historic trauma, and wanting to move past it. The problem with wanting to move past it and without addressing the war crimes, no one's gone to jail for any of the horrible things they did. There hasn't been a Nuremberg-style trial for us, and the United States hasn't declassified enough documents. And an organization that really talks about this a lot is CSPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. They have a lot of resources going back to the 1980s about this. The anti-war movement in El Salvador is very old, and the sanctuary movement, as it regards Central American people, is also very old. And so this has been going on for a long time, and Nayib Bukele sort of seemed to seemingly unite the country, but it erased a lot of how we got here. He declared himself as the first president of the post-war, and it's just okay, well, we're 30 years into the post-war, and we never really dealt with the traumas and the crimes that happened at that time. So he sort of took advantage of El Salvadoran people's need to want to move on, and in that moving on, we've forgotten a lot of lessons about how we got to these authoritarian leaders in the first place. And so Nayib Bukele is sort of playing from the playbook of old Salvadoran dictators and stripping rights, throwing people in jail, and he's able to throw a lot of people in jail because of the gang war that's been happening. For those who don't know, El Salvador in the 90s after the war, because of President Clinton's 1996 deportation measures called IRIRA. I don't know exactly what IRIRA stands for, but I'll look it up in a minute. But basically, it led to mass incarceration. It was during the time of the crime bill. It led to mass incarceration for people who were not citizens. That led to mass deportation. So it was called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, the IRIRA Act of '96, and it basically made it easier for it basically made more offenses become deportable. Before you had to really do something like awful to be deported, like perhaps murder or something like that, and then this made the sort of it made the crimes like it made more crimes eligible for deportation. So then you see this massive influx of people with criminal backgrounds, people who've been in the system in El Salvador, in the United States, by that. MS-13, the gang started in the United States, in Los Angeles, that needs to be told. And this war-torn country, because in the 90s, El Salvador was recovering, economically was recovering from a lot of things during the war. So they didn't really have enough social programs to like move on from the war if we were going to be real. So then you have an influx of people who have been neglected by the system, who have been abused by the system, come into El Salvador, and their only option is to fend for themselves in a criminal way. And you got to think about a lot of these kids in this initial first wave of the gang learned a lot of violence, learned a lot of combat, because we had child soldiers in the Salvadoran War, which is another thing that never got really addressed in the peace accords or any of these things. So you know, we had this perfect like kind of perfect storm when it comes to Nayib Bukele. We're sick and tired of violence in our communities. You know, you almost see kind of parallels with this like tough on crime stuff that gets sort of blown out of proportion sometimes to get people to want these punitive measures. Like right now we're going through in El Salvador, it's called mano dura or iron fist, and they're basically throwing many people in jail without trial, without a fair trial, without sentence limits, without even giving their family members or themselves the reason why they were arrested. So there's a suspension of civil liberties under what we call the state of exception. It was supposed to be temporary. It's a kind of a state of emergency that the Bukele administration sort of flirted with during quarantine, and was like, okay, let's make this a regular thing. And it suspends all kinds of civil liberties in terms of being arrested, but it also affects the press. The press can't report on these things, and so, or they would be thrown in jail from targets. So we have the situation in El Salvador where the information is not coming out because of the propaganda of the government of El Salvador, but also because the information isn't making it out of El Salvador in an efficient way. There's people still reporting on the ground. There's still very brave people resisting in El Salvador. But that solidarity hasn't really been built, and a lot of people who are of Salvadoran descent who live in the United States, like me, for example, they are more disconnected from El Salvador than I. They probably only have a relative because of the way immigration system is set up, because of the way displacement has been set up, that they're getting a very distorted view of El Salvador from maybe their loved one who has consumed a lot of propaganda. Or they're just getting the propaganda from the internet and not really verifying with people on the ground, and people on the ground being afraid to talk. So
I did.
that's kind of where El Salvador is.
Okay. You know, interesting. I meant to tell you this last time we talked. I had a student from Colombia, emigrated years ago, and the first time I did this lesson, and I, you know, mentioned Nayib Bukele was, I didn't say bad guy, but authoritarian leader. She looked at me and credited. She was like, "Wait, I thought he was the good guy." You know, and I had to sort of discuss in a way, you know, perspective and who you are and where you stand from. But it did catch me off guard, and I had to remember that different peoples have different perspectives of, or what they're hearing from home. Because I was like, okay, I got an idea of where that's coming from and who's, you know, facilitating that narrative. The way you talk about historical memory, it reminds me of the way that a lot of people, elders in Lebanon, talk about the Lebanese Civil War and just the overarching concept of the further away a society gets away from a really defining traumatic event, that the next generations, you know, they're not as influenced by it. You know, you might be familiar with it, but the directions and actions you take, you know, if you weren't there, you didn't know what happened. It can definitely seem kind of terrifying to older generations to look at it and say, we're making the same mistakes again.
Yeah.
And I have had a few Salvador...
Go ahead. Continue. No, I was just kind of going to react to that. A lot of Latin Americans that I've met have gotten the propaganda. They'll be from Dominican Republic, they'll be from Colombia, they'll be from Panama, Guatemala. They'll be like, I want a president just like El Salvador's. And it's just like, there's something behind the messages that you're being given that you're not being told. But yeah. It's a common among Latin Americans to think that El Salvador's on the right track.
And to tie it all back to, we were initially talking about WHINSEC and School of the Americas and police violence. That institute is huge, part of the ecosystem that has come into existence today, and how, why El Salvador went through what it did. Not sole motivator, but definitely a big part of that ecosystem. And in Atlanta here, we also have the GILI program, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is often noted for police exchanges between the U.S. and Israeli police and border patrol. But they've definitely engaged with Brazil, and I believe Japan as well. The '96 Olympics in Atlanta really elevated and escalated the mass surveillance, state here, and mass displacement as well. And then today, of course, we've got Cop City. For those of you who don't know, is a $90 million+ project with at least a third of it's going to be coming from public funds to clear cut one of the 4 major green spaces around the metro area. Anti-black environmental racism, because that's where all of this is going to take place, for a massive police and fire training facility. Much to the dismay and disagreement of the local community and many others. I know we said before, is it a local issue? Cop City is, but also it's going to have national implications as well for, this is just where they want to start. And to bring it back to the article on the screen, it's interesting that you would say that the Biden administration is not receptive to it. So what does that say about the Atlanta City Council that they are? If this seems like the people you want to get in bed with, not just for development and business interests, but the related state violence that comes with facilitating that process and maintaining that. One of the big statements about why Cop City, like just why it's existing, it's the bourgeoisie, the liberal bourgeoisie, sort of making it clear to developers that this is a safe place to park your money, and we will do whatever it takes, including putting people down to keep your money here.
Yeah, the fact that that I'm assuming that the government in Atlanta is very like right wing. It's
bourgeoisie liberals who
Republican led.
No, the city of Atlanta, it's all like, it's a lot of, not exclusively, but like older guard black capitalists, sort of, they claim they take on MLK Jr.'s civil rights sort of thing, but they're anything but in many cases, and huge advocates of APD. And there's a joke that Atlanta is really run by like 6 corporations, the Atlanta Police Foundation, and the Chamber of Commerce. That's really who dictates, what happens here. From mass gentrification to, projects like Cop City. So yes, functionally it is, but they would not call themselves that.
I see. It's very interesting to see like because the Salvadoran sort of, the Salvadoran government and the regime there, it's been very interesting how they've sort of been playing their America relationships, their relationship with America. For one, the United States has the most people from El Salvador of any other country outside of itself. So it's an important like trading partner. It's an important just source of tourism. Just people going to see their loved ones, not even factoring in other Americans who go to El Salvador. So it's a very important country to sort of appeal to. So it's interesting to me how the Salvadoran government has been sort of skirting these accusations of human rights abuses. And the president of El Salvador, Bukele, he'll go on Fox's Carl Tuckerson show and talk about, how good what he's doing to the country is going to lead to less immigration, and sort of just show sort of like the different sort of white supremacist sort of tendencies of the Salvadoran regime.
I think I'm losing you.
Kind of a part of that because Cop City, El Salvador is cop country, so it makes sense that cop country and Cop City are, shaking hands.
I hate that I'm laughing at that, but that's poignant.
Yeah.
Something else you had mentioned earlier, and I'd seen you say this on Twitter as well, why we don't talk about, earlier I mentioned like the poor education we get about Central America, and especially during my youth.
Hmm.
Like, you can't really talk about it in these things without framing America as the bad guy, and being really explicit about that.
Yeah, you can't talk about Central America and policy of Central America going back the last 100 years, but we'll just focus on the last 40 for my sake and the sake of the show. But we because of the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America has specifically always been seen as United States' backyard, and so the United States feels it could meddle into our politics, into our sovereignty. And like I mentioned earlier, Guatemala, the coup, the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita Banana, wanted favorable business conditions, so installed a president that was going to be pro-U.S. capitalist Chiquita Banana, the United Fruit Company interests. And so what you see with El Salvador and Central America is kind of, the United States has always protected its business interests in the region. And that has meant putting leaders that are friendly to the United States in power. And so we're at an interesting point where, like, well, let me go back. Let me go back for a second. Talking about the war in El Salvador, I mentioned there's millions of displaced people. If you look at the refugee sort of numbers of the time, the immigration numbers, less than like 3% of people fleeing Guatemala and El Salvador got any sort of refugee status. Because in the 1980s, to admit that people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and other Central American countries facing war were refugees would be to admit that the United States strategy on Central America was wrong. And we know that it is because of how many people got displaced, how many people died. But there's never been any formal acknowledgement by the United States, for the United States government, that they did anything wrong. That they, there's still a lot of classified documents. There hasn't been an apology. Sometimes you'll see with other conflicts around the world that some parties will apologize for some of the things they've done. So we haven't even gotten sort of like any of the basic breadcrumbs of justice or decency from the my community got TPS, temporary protected status. In fact, my sister had it in the 90s, and it was for people who it's basically like an early DACA. It's like a precursor to DACA, okay, in the sense that it's a work permit. There is no pathway to citizenship. You can just work and not be removed from the country, and that's it. And it's temporary. So it was kind of
the government
the same thing
says
as
so,
DACA,
or is there conditions?
Every 18 months it needs to be renewed based on both governments coming to an agreement. So sometimes the governments don't come to an agreement, and it's activists in the United States themselves and documented activists will come. But at the time, in the 1990s, the temporary protected status came into effect because of the Flores Agreement. If you look up the Flores Agreement, it's basically a settlement against it centers like a sort of a Jane Doe figure, like a Jennifer Flores, but I think it was actually a couple of Salvadoran girls who were thrown with adults in immigration detention during the Civil War era and were abused. So that protection, temporary protected status, came out of not just like benevolence in the United States, but they had abused children in immigration custody. And so that was, I guess, a win. But and then when the peace accords happened, people got sent back because it was no longer Salvador was no longer at war.
Okay. So I recently attended one of your talks with Dartmouth, I think it was, and you presented some really great information, because at the end of this show is supposed to be about geography and really using maps. And I love everything you're talking about, but I also love the tools you present, which you collected a couple of resources there about maps as sort of tools for pushing back against disinformation, or adding more context at the very least, especially when we talk about things, the violence that comes out of those sorts of conflicts, genocide, that can really inhibit cultural proliferation. Certain demographics get hit harder, and then to use the narrative or the dialogue that says we're moving past the war, but to use the same tactics to ultimately harm a lot of the same groups, I want to move into a little bit about how those things you were talking about, mass incarceration, and yields less of X people in the public space or in the country. I think the 2% of El Salvador's population is imprisoned at the moment, or is it 2% of men? I feel like I've read that, and what impact that has on communities. The claim of 0 homicides in a year, that's a big claim. And even if some semi-oppositional media is backing that, you've talked before about what that claim misses, and how understanding human geography is going to help us understand how demographics move, and one particular action by the government is going to impact the demographics in other ways.
Yeah, so El Salvador, because of its state of emergency, has now surpassed the United States. El Salvador is the #1 most incarcerated country per capita. That means that, the population is obviously smaller than the United States, but per every 100,000 people, there's more incarcerated people in El Salvador than the United States. That has led to 2% of El Salvador's adult population, which is roughly 100,000 people, was in prison. So that is a large number of the population. El Salvador isn't a huge country. It's like 6 million people. So, you would think that El Salvador has been a year under this, they have put 100,000 people in jail. They're building jails. You'd think that they would suspend the state of emergency. I thought, you fixed it, you made it safe. Anecdotally, a lot of people do report feeling safe. A lot of people do report feeling safe in the sense of like, well, it's hard to tell how much of this is manufactured by Nayib Bukele's media and the pro-police propaganda. But I don't doubt that some people do feel a certain kind of safety in the sense of like, yeah, okay, certain gangs have been disbanded, some gangs have been disbanded, but now the monopoly of violence has swung in favor of the state. So now the state can do whatever it wants. So what you're starting to see more is that like people are being disappeared from working class neighborhoods, from areas that the poorest people, they're not going to San Salvador, they're not going to the rich neighborhoods like El Escalon, Santa Marta, Antiguo Cuscatlan, places where it's safe year-round, tourists feel okay going. They're going for the people that if you disappear them, no one, or they hope no one is going to make a noise about that. And we look at El Salvador's history, because El Salvador also deals with a lot of like internalized racism and colorism. A lot of the people in the nice parts tend to look whiter, and you go into the rural communities and people have more racialized features. They're more mixed with indigenous or black. And El Salvador, to talk about this and to talk about racism in the context of like mass incarceration and the hemisphere, it's important to note that El Salvador was one of the last countries to recognize its indigenous population, like in 2010s, once they had a left-wing government in power. And then they have failed to recognize any African presence in the country, even though El Salvador was a country that participated in the slave trade. And many Salvadorans, whether they're mixed or they look a certain way, do have African ancestry. And so this is a country that historically has tried to disappear its black folks, because we don't have a Caribbean coast as like the other countries do. That's sort of used as an excuse. Like people migrate. People migrate. Those borders are especially porous throughout history. But in the 1940s, there was a dictator called Maximiliano Hernandez, so quote unquote, not just banned black people, he also banned Asian people coming from the Middle East. He only wanted white migration to El Salvador. And this is not just unique to El Salvador as well. Like all of these countries from Argentina up to Mexico were going through what we call blanqueamiento, to attract or whitening, to attract European immigrants into these countries. What happened with El Salvador as well in 1932, which was a precursor to the war, 1932, it was an indigenous massacre. They massacred over 1,000, if not more, indigenous peoples, mostly from the Nahua group, which is sometimes known as Pipil in El Salvador. And they're the last remaining group with an indigenous language that's still intact. that is like spoken and has revitalization efforts. And so at the root of all of this policing and all of this violence against the general population, and like I said, they racially profile you. There is this like history of genocide, history of denial of historically marginalized populations, and that's something that is not unique to El Salvador. It's as much as the history is horrible, it's not unique to El Salvador. The whole hemisphere, especially the United States, has participated in some ways these sort of like white supremacist violences. But my mother always told me, I would always love my mother because she came from a revolutionary family, and I would always ask her, it's like, hey, what do you think is going to happen? How do you think El Salvador is ever going to get better? Because we had to leave because it was bad. What do you think? And she's like, well, every 50 years El Salvador has a revolution, and just not because like Salvador people just want to burn shit down all the time. It's the sense that like the conditions don't
It's on
change.
the calendar,
and the conditions don't change. Yeah, it's like, oh, it's our time to just set the government on fire. But no, it's like the conditions don't change. So in 1932, you saw an indigenous uprising, and it led to indigenous culture being either like squished or like gone underground. So if you're indigenous, like you took your cultural practices and you practiced them not openly, which is like you go to neighboring Guatemala, and Guatemala has had their issues with indigenous genocide as recent as the 1980s, like explicit indigenous genocide. But people there aren't like conquered in the same way. Like they're proud, they speak their language, they wear their dress, they wear their traditional weaving, and it's something that El Salvador does not have a strong enough culture of. And we look, the Civil War was 50 years after that, so the grandchildren of that era like had a Marxist insurgency, and the war started in 1980. That was 40 years ago. We're looking at potentially 10 years with Nayib Bukele. He's already completed like 4 of those years if he wants to run again, which is illegal, but he might do it.
Can you clarify El Salvador's constitution as it relates to the executive office and what he's doing?
Yes. Okay. So I'll finish my point. So it's been 40 years since the Civil War. If we have a couple more years under this fascist dictatorship, we're going to be ripe for another civil unrest in El Salvador. That's just what I'll say. I'm not going to say I'm predicting a war, but you just asked about Nayib Bukele. What was the question again?
Specifically to break down like what he's violating in terms of El Salvador's constitution,
yes.
And it's about the executive office.
Yes. So Nayib Bukele wants to run again for president, which is illegal in El Salvador. You can run twice for president, but you can't run consecutively. So El Salvador, you are president for 5 years, not 4 like the United States. So for those 5 years, you're president. You cannot run the term after you've completed. You can run again after those next 5 years, after someone else does 5 years. So like, there is consecutive, there is re-election, not consecutively though. And so Nayib Bukele wants to do away with that and just be president for another 5 more years, which would make his tenure a decade. And, El Salvador's democracy is very new. It goes back to 1992 when we signed our peace accords. We had to sort of reset democracy and practiced it for once in our lives, because honestly, there wasn't really a democracy. And I can say that though El Salvador hasn't been perfect, there's been a lot of issues. One of the wins from the war was that people can vote, people can speak against political parties that they don't like, and they can express themselves in that way. That's like probably one of the only rights we won during that war, and it's never conceptualized like that because people don't talk about it enough. But that's something that is sort of being lost in this process, because you can't really oppose Nayib Bukele openly without being attacked. If you're a public employee, he'll fire you. His first couple days in office, he just fired people off Twitter, just listing the names off Twitter. He also took control of the Supreme Court, so he took judges that didn't align with his goals. He just fired them. He took them out, and then he has a majority in the legislature and in the Congress, and he controls the legislature. So Nayib Bukele controls all 3 branches of government. The way they justify this is that Salvadoran people are happy. Salvadoran people are happy. They feel safe, and his approval ratings are really high, which is like, okay. So they're calling him a populist, which he is. So he's sort of a populist dictator, and it's not something we haven't seen in Latin America. A lot of people compare Nayib Bukele to President Fujimori in Peru, who was a populist who played the left and the right like by Nayib Bukele. Was from an ethnic minority. Fujimori was Japanese, and Nayib Bukele is Palestinian, which is a whole can of worms. Um, and they also disappeared people systematically, which is what Nayib Bukele's regime is doing now, and what people call the dirty war in Peru. But was, sometimes I feel like that's not the best descriptor for it, but it's the popular one, and it kind of mirrors this gang war that we have going on, where it's like, you're guilty until proven innocent. You may never be proven innocent because we don't do trials. So. It's very concerning that he wants to keep consolidating power beyond these 5 years that he's had. And some people have theories that like he doesn't want to be indicted by the United States because a lot of people in his cabinet had been indicted due to misappropriating funds for the COVID emergency, which is sort of like a looking glass into the corruption in the Bukele administration. If they're doing this with COVID funds, what else kind of corruptions that we haven't even heard about is going on that would probably come to light if a new administration came in. So it is beneficial for him to stay in power so he just doesn't get indicted on top of just like the general power hungriness of himself. In 2024, there's going to be a new election, and he's already said that he wants to run again, even though the Constitution doesn't go for that. So I feel like we're hesitating calling Nayib Bukele's presidency a dictatorship because he was elected and he's a populist leader, but once it gets to the point of another mandate like that, then I feel like that's when the world will probably catch up and start calling him that. But that's going to be too late. And yeah, I mean, his fans are probably happy. He has a lot of support. And I don't want to discount the fact that a lot of Salvadorans really, 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 really wanted to feel safe. They really wanted someone to intervene. And so maybe they are happy with him, but it doesn't justify the loss of human rights that this is going to bring. People talk about the homicide rate being down in El Salvador. The homicide rate is down because two things. The government is not very transparent in reporting people. And if someone dies in custody in their jails, if a cop kills someone, those do not count in the official homicide statistics. So like I said, the state has the monopoly on the violence now, and they can kill everybody, and it wouldn't show up in a report. So you can't really believe that these homicides are down. On top of the homicides not being down, the number of disappearances of Salvadorans has not changed. Salvadorans are disappearing. They're being found in mass graves. I think the theory is that, like, well, if there's no bodies, you can't say they're homicides, which is a problem. Yeah. And so there's still a missing persons crisis in El Salvador, and there's an account on Twitter called Desaparecidos SV that has a lot of this content. But how can you say it's safe when people are being disappeared and you don't know where they're going or where they're ending up? So for me, this whole period of El Salvador being safer is a smokescreen. It's not the accurate picture of what's going on. And when this does come to light, I'm afraid that it might be a little too late.
I think it's fair to say, too, that a lot of world leaders are a bit more authoritarian than, a lot of people want to admit, even if they are elected. I just lost my thought where I was going to go with that. How much of that is rooted in appeasing a certain, you talked about different programs for advocating or advancing U.S. and European immigration. How much of this sort of the racialized and even classist targeting, or people are less concerned when those groups disappear, is appeasement of like settlement and development, especially around Bitcoin? You've talked a bit about that before in your bodies of work. Is it part of like, hey, we need to get you out of here because we want to develop this area for the tourist, or?
I don't think it's happening exactly like in a straight sort of cut way like that. But I do think that that is a strategy that is being followed in the sense that, like, Salvadorans are still being displaced from their homes. They're still migrating. Nayib Bukele's Bitcoin plan, for those who don't know, that El Salvador was the first country to nationalize Bitcoin. It's flopped. People don't really use it, but it has attracted a lot of American investors, European investors who tend to be white from the first world, and they see El Salvador as a good place to maybe money launder. Because let's be clear, what is this Bitcoin stuff about? With these regimes, like, what do they want it for? Especially if it's losing value so much and they keep pushing it so hard. So you're starting to see, like, people, including in the Nayib Bukele cabinet, there's a ministry of, like, investment or something that is, like, led by these two, like white Americans. One is, like, named Kaiser's last name. I forget it. Max Kaiser, I think. He's like a Bitcoin evangelist, and then there's a woman as well. But
Bitcoin evangelist, what a term!
Yeah, and so he's brought them into the government to sort of grow that part of the country, and it's basically, El Salvador is under a lot of debt because of the Bitcoin stuff. It's been using what we suspect to be public money. We say suspect is because they don't actually tell us. They're not transparent about, like, the buying and selling of these Bitcoin transactions, but we can assume that they're probably misappropriating funds from the government in some way, and so the people aren't getting their social services. There's talks about the Social Security being gutted, and we're also under the colonial sort of financial power structures, like you think of, like, the IMF, the World Bank, and the IMF is not going to give El Salvador any loans because of the Bitcoin stuff. The IMF has told El Salvador not to do Bitcoin, and El Salvador President Nayib Bukele has come out as, like, tried to sound like a decolonial champion, like, we're doing Bitcoin for our sovereignty, like, F the World Bank, and, like, I totally get that, and I totally get playing up to that, but the point of the fact of the matter is that he's tanking the country's economy one way or another, and you're starting to see sort of that debt creeping up on El Salvador. But on top of that, he's hoping that these, like, gringo American foreign investors are going to save him and buy his, what he calls, volcano bonds, which is like these bonds of money, of Bitcoin money, and to invest. And he is minded on displacing people. He has El Salvador has a historic fight for clean water, historic fight against mining. We are the first country to ban mining in the last, I think, 10 years. It's been.
What was the primary resource being extracted from El Salvador?
Gold. I want to say it was gold. I'm pretty sure it was gold. I have to double check on that, though. If it wasn't gold, the point was that whatever was being mined was destroying the groundwater. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't so much about the resource they were extracting as much as, like, that resource extraction was destroying the water. And El Salvador's 80% of its water is not drinkable. It is the most deforested country in Central America. There's not going to be clean water in 80 years if it continues at this rate. So you would think a leader like Nayib Bukele, thinking of just the existential survival of his country, would care about the water and the environment. But he put the Santa Marta five water defenders were arbitrarily jailed in the state of exception in January. They're called the Santa Marta Five, and I haven't really talked a whole lot about them yet, as I'm still, like, kind of collecting things. But it's something that's been going on for 3 months now, that needs more attention. And on top of going after water defenders, a lot of these places where the mass arrests are happening, like Usulutan, Soyapango, La Libertad, these are all places that are primed for development, primed to be cleansed of the undesirables, which is what he's doing. calling them criminals. So like everybody's on board with, you know, getting rid of these people. And then, you know, suddenly when these people are gone, you know, seizing their land, to build a resort for Bitcoiners or for gringos, or even the jail, like that jail that he built in Santana. That was land that he had to take from people. And what people don't realize about El Salvador is that it's so tiny that land is everything. Land is at the center of all of our revolutions, all of our things, because, you know, you go back to settler colonialism, a lot of that indigenous land is indigenous land that has been taken away. And you see that a lot in Guatemala, where like indigenous peoples are still fighting for for their ancestral lands with the government. In El Salvador, the majority of the population is no longer has indigenous identity because I said of the genocide that happened in the 30s. That being said, they're still being sort of displaced by the same sort of agribusiness and like tourism sort of minded sectors of the economy and the sort of government who would like to financially benefit from some of that. And so one of my predictions is that, you know, if he does successfully court these Bitcoin investors, because he's not being successful with Bitcoin, and I need to be clear with that, it's like a flop. But he is hoping to bring in these new white people to come modernize the country, which is essentially just like a blanqueamiento or whitening of the olden period, where European immigrants were sort of given free passage into El Salvador. And, you know, it's kind of hard to see like a country where like so many people can no longer go back to because of various reasons of U.S. intervention and border imperialism. And then these people who've just heard of El Salvador yesterday think like, oh, well, I'm into Bitcoin. This is where I need to be. And it's just like, what? So, you know, we'll see. We'll see how that turns out. I can't really make any predictions other than like it's not doing well, and if it does do well, it's going to have disastrous consequences for the population.
The way you spoke about the 5 water defenders, aside, we can, you know, find those connections here, both with Standing Rock, but also the 40 plus people who are the state is claiming are domestic terrorists in regards to defending the forest where Cop City is going to be built, where at the moment things are, you know, their charges look like, well, they were hanging in a hammock in a tree together, where they have mud on their shoes, and therefore they are terrorists. And the delegitimizing of people who are resisting those sorts of things. You know, the relationship between climate justice and increased police brutality is, you know, they're not really preparing to make sure that we can get water or that we can have shade. They're preparing to keep us in our place when we're pissed that we're not getting either of those things. It sounds like Bukele's right on board with all of that.
Yep. Like, you know, the fact that so much of what Cop City, the resistance to it is also, there's an environmental component as well. And I think that's like a dot that most people in El Salvador haven't really connected about what's going on with El Salvador, just because right now it's like, well, you know, we're just going to see how the naive resources and capitalism are like at the core of these struggles, these like sort of parallel struggles that kind of inform each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming up on an hour now. Is there anything else? I want to move into the actual lesson portion here for your critiques and insights and what you might want American kids, regardless of demographic, to learn about El Salvador in the context of geography. But is there anything else that you feel like we didn't touch on that you wanted to get out?
No, I think we touched everything. I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay. So, and if anything comes up, let me know. And if you're, as we're watching this or going through these slides here, you know, if there's any conversation to have, please feel to jump in. So I'm going to bring up the share screen here. So we're talking about human geography and economic geography, how people move and how resources move, in a very introductory way for the youths. This was designed mostly for 9th grade, you know, 14, 15-year-olds, but it can certainly be go the other way here for be developed for otherwise. So I did take, and I know there's issues around, National Geographic as a primary resource. It is intended for a very specific audience and tends to focus on particular things. So I get people's critiques. A number of the resources in here are from the UN and a particular Nat Geo article from, I want to say 2019, maybe 2020. I forget the title. I have it in here somewhere at the end. So this is the opening. It's for a lot of it where I've worked or been, sort of semi-suburban, sort of the edge of urban, suburban environments, and there's a broad spectrum of class and race demographics available. So have a look at this picture. What's the furthest you've ever walked? Why did you do it? And when did you feel compelled to break the rules and you thought that was the appropriate answer? And whatever sort of conversations that ensue out of that is what opens us into the units. What do you see here? I had the citation for this image at the end, but crossing one of the many waterways on the way from El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala to the U.S. We got to do, we got to get the vocab first, so they have a little document that they fill out as we go. Not just migration in terms for it, but also the concept of legal status. And not everything is a legal status. Some things are just functional definitions, but the UN as an entity that sort of governs these sorts of things, it's probably important for them to know. And we'll go over the process. This link here takes us to the customs. Yes, here we are. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Like, what is an asylum hearing? Is it an easy process? What do you need? And what are the credentials of it? I think it was a year or two ago I was teaching this and talking about how they sort of shift the goalposts on, say, like whether or not you're actually being discriminated on X, Y, Z, like you spoke about with refugees there, or LGBTQ issues, or can you prove within their threshold that you're actually going to die if you stay there? I remember reading one time, they're like, well, the political group that doesn't like you is actually not the majority in the area you live in, so we don't know if we're really going to qualify you for that sort of thing. Refugee IDPs, and these are just there's also Syria and Myanmar here as other examples going on in the world right now where that might be these words would be applicable as well. Non-refoulement, which of course I love to talk about the opportunity how international law is selected and chosen or ignored at the country's whims. Those sorts of things. And then, of course, they need to know about push and pull factors. This is actually a link to your video I think you did for AJ Plus a couple of years ago on climate change. It's pushing people out of Central America. And then we talked about earlier, I make sure to give them of the gang violence and how the U.S. proliferated that and created a lot of context in the circumstances of today. And one of their other vocabulary words is femicide. How that works. So we do that. Those are the major words they'll need. As far as the actual task I have them do, behind me in my picture here, I actually have taken these images from that article and blew them up. I've got 3 of them. This one is the homicide rate by municipality in 2017. This is a infographic of homicides, which you've pointed out before. Homicide was already on the decline long before Bukele came into power. And a lot of right-wing any authoritarian loves to say, look, I've been doing this. It's really like was the motivation or the momentum was started by previous administrations. About who is where, this is like...
administration.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and the previous administration to Nayib Bukele was FMLN, which was... Marxist organization. They didn't govern like Marxists because like that wasn't kind of allowed, but it was a left-leaning government that we saw the decline of the MS-13 and the gangs, or the homicides rather that Nayib Bukele took. He took credit for it. He took credit for a lot of work that was already on the way when he took power. Just is what it is.
So they examine these stats. There's some bit about when immigration, popped off and how much of the percentage of the population is where, and also the concept of leakage. Like, I really try to drive home on this. Kids, especially at that age, they're like, well, they come to America for a better life. I was like, first of all, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
But two, not everybody wants to stay here, and not everyone is here because they want to be, and some people are compelled to be, and do want their, to go back home, or at least their family back where they came from is doing the best that they can, and assisting with that. Not everyone is dying to come to America and stay to America.
Yeah,
and then
I
this
think,
is
people. Yeah, people, if they didn't want to move, if they didn't have to move, they probably wouldn't leave everything they knew.
But if talking about moving, this is from another Nat Geo article, the most common immigration routes. The article itself has every part of the world, not just Central America, but examining this. So they have to do these three, the two maps and the infographic there, and they have to come up with questions on their own, like what's something else that this material makes you think of? Give me some observations. What do you see as it relates to El Salvador? And then what are some other inquiries that you have about the material that these maps don't answer? And then this is, we talked about the El Mazote massacre. You'll recall this piece, I think, came out, in 2021. So I showed them about 5-minute clip of it towards the end, and about the judiciary going after it, and the Bukele administration pushing back on the judiciary going after it. Like you said earlier, that there is little to no repercussions or justice or restitution for the people who were the victims of this.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about this political cartoon here, and we watched the 5-minute video, and we talk about that. And then I added this one. This is your Bitcoin article. I haven't had an opportunity to try this.
Sweet.
But I kind of want to come up with some sort of activity that sort of emulates what these alternative currencies look like and why they flop. But I have to do a little more research on that one there. But it's a good little read. We go into that a little bit, or I would like to in the future. And that's like the first day collecting information. I don't know if you read this one. This is the, what happens to deportees, another vocabulary word. We talked about non-refoulement earlier, and you're not supposed to send someone back if they're claiming asylum, but happens all the time. And I actually have them read, we annotate and answer some questions of 3 of the, what's the word I'm looking for? The testimonials of people who have been deported and what they went through, and not everyone makes it, or maybe HRW lost contact with some of those people after they were deported and couldn't follow up on it. And so we take a look at that material, and then we speak on that. They have to do a little formal annotation and ask some questions and answer some questions. Also introducing them to the concept of what is an NGO, because there's lots of critiques about organizations like HRW and Amnesty, questionable approaches that they have sometimes. However, it's also how do we collect data, and what do you do with that?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the second day's task. And then the big one that I want them to go home to is, could you, if you had to do it, would you be able to identify this material, where it is now, and could you get what you needed to do what was required to survive in those circumstances? Like that very first picture we looked at in this. And not every kid knows where their birth certificate is, or they know that they have one and they don't know who's holding on to it, and who would they ask to give them a letter of recommendation. And if they had to, because one of the HRW testimonies is, he had pictures of his murdered sister as part of the evidence, and could you make it is ultimately the self reflections that I'm asking of them. They don't need to show me their birth certificate or anything like that. I just need you to come through and say, I know where this is and I can do it. And if you couldn't do it, it's fine. You just need to explain that.
Okay.
And that's the sort
That's
of
good.
culminating. Yeah. And then, of course, we always try to bring it back just to a little local awareness. GLAR, the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, and how they, limited capacities in terms of lawyers and defending people who are going through deportation processing. And one of the things we look at in the HRW testimonies is voluntary deportation versus involuntary, and like how that still costs you money. But educating people how to not get caught in the system, the best that one can, is part of that. And then this is just these are the resources that I used. So
Okay,
that
great.
is
Yeah.
Any thoughts, questions, critiques? Anything I could be doing different, better,
I
based on
think
what
these
you
are
know?
good resources. I think these are good resources based on like you know, appropriate for the age group and appropriate, like, you know, it's good to get them into primary sources and like you know, because some people will be like, okay, well, like the UN Human Rights Watch are these big NGOs that have like history and all this stuff. But I think, you know, for younger folks who are sort of building their knowledge base and like sort of building their cases in terms of like what they know in the world and defending their thoughts and stuff like that, I think these are um, great sources, because I even use these sources as well in my reporting as well when I'm looking for something. It's just like, well, we live in an imperfect world where like you're never going to find that one source who probably, you know, comes at the issue in your angle. Like, you know, Nat Geo has done some important reporting on El Salvador. Nat Geo's also done some harmful reporting. And I bring up this example of in the early 2000s, there was this magazine and video, but I remember the magazine cover, and I remember that there was also a documentary video called "World's Most Dangerous Gang" from El Salvador, and it was very sensationalist. It painted Salvadorans in a certain way, and it sort of introduced the gang imagery to the United States. So, you know, I think it's always important to you know, to 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 just be mindful of the sources sometimes. But I also realize that Nat Geo is like that, like very accessible thing when you're young. I remember, at least, I don't know if kids do this today, like reading the Nat Geo books and like collections at like doctors' offices or old people's houses, and they were the best. I had the best time with those things, and I think these are some solid sort of sources to get started on. I do want to add something because I feel like when you mentioned El Mozote, and I sent this to you in the chat, but there is a sort of an accessible way to talk about this. It is called, in Spanish, it's called Luciérnagas El Mozote, which translates to fireflies at El Mozote. But it was written based on the testimony of a survivor. So there was like one of the very few survivors of that war who pretended to be dead herself. They killed her children, her whole family. It's sad, but it's something that ideally, if there was a good curriculum in El Salvador, you would read that in the same way that you would read like about World War II and the Holocaust, as a sort of like educational, like sort of first person account. So that book is in English it's called just Massacre at El Mozote, Massacre at El Mozote, and you know, it's something that you could probably find an excerpt and print out and read to the class or something. I don't know, I don't remember how. It's not terribly big, but I just don't think they like mass produce it enough quantities in the U.S. It's not something that you can probably find at like the textbook store from Texas or whatever. But I think that's something good to teach about El Mozote, because I think El Mozote is something that's very hard to. It's very hard for someone to conceptualize, even like for us, like El Mozote. Like my parents didn't really know a lot about El Mozote because even though they lived in El Salvador during the 80s, this was very under wraps, so very covered up. And so this first person account is just I think good for just anyone who wants to get to the humanity and the callousness and the horribleness was that intervention at its probably worst moment. But yeah, I think El Mozote is something that I think a lot of people, a lot of Central Americans, when we're young, we learn about like in college now. If we get to that part of college and we get to the ethnic studies class, I think I've heard some people even teaching as young as high school, which is, I think in El Salvador that's like kind of the more appropriate. Like some places that are like a little bit more like left leaning will teach this in high school. Some places don't teach this at all. In fact, it's the daughter of the woman story in the book. She's had to flee El Salvador because you know, this is still going to trial. Like they barely like arrested someone like last couple months who's like an old man in Spain or something. So but I think when teaching about El Mozote, this is sort of like the standard both in El Salvador and I would say even in like ethnic studies classes in the United States. Just to give it a little bit of a more personal touch too, because it's just like, it's such a gruesome story. It's such a gruesome story. definitely requires a lot of content warnings.
Okay.
But
Thank you for this.
yeah, I
And you may
think
bring up a good point there. It's education. It's easy to get stuck talking about someone instead of letting them speak for themselves on the issue. So thank you for this, and I will definitely add this in.
yeah, no problem. That was just like sort of the only thing, just because I thought that'd be like a nice, easy way to plug into the lesson. I think everything. The rest of the lesson sort of resonates with me in sense of like you're getting people to empathize with other experiences and you know, having to physically look at a map and think about like how far people are coming from, um, and also the parallels with these other places that are dealing with refugees and migration, because this is a battle that is like global. It is about solidarity, and it's just like, you know, when you see someone like die on the border for whatever reason, you tend to see same things happening in the Mediterranean, for example. Um, and you know, we need a much, you know, sort of stronger international awareness about these things, especially if we want to uphold some of these international laws that we don't really uphold, whether we're in El Salvador or the United States.
Well, pointing our fingers at the other nation for not upholding it. And I brought this one up as well. This is one of the resources you sent me. And that maybe even, you know, some schools are dual language. I'm not literate in Spanish. I studied Arabic in college, and I'm not literate in that either. But to start using resources in another language, the kids have Google Translate. They can figure it out. That this should be normalized too, especially in populations like I've worked in lots of different places where there is a large Latino population. So, yes, yeah, this sort of material, even, you know, English doesn't always necessarily need to be catered to, and other kids should be challenged in that way too. And kids who speak Spanish should be able to embrace that in the classroom too. So I will find a way to put this to address this with it as well.
Yeah, you can also run it through a browser. It could be like a fun lesson on how to translate using a browser. I feel like
There you
as
go.
a journalist, sometimes I'm looking at things in French, and I'm like, I don't understand French. Let me do as best as I can.
Yeah, and then what an opportunity to have discussions with kids about, like, hey, it's not perfect. Prepositions don't always translate one-to-one, but this is a helpful tool for you. Oh, that's a great idea. Thank you. For sure. So I will add that in there. And that's all
It's not
I
going to
got
translate
for
the
you.
images, though.
You know,
Okay. Yeah, no.
they're going to have to figure that out. They can go to their friend who
Yeah.
does speak Spanish and say, give me $1 or give me some candy that you got over there and translate this. Don't do it for free, kids. Yeah. So that's what I got.
So this map.
Go ahead. Yeah. You want to speak on this a little bit?
Oh yeah. Just to explain to the audience. So this map is basically a map of arbitrary detentions in El Salvador, and they're basically concentrated in two regions. The one in the more south east region is Usulutan, which is a lot of fisheries. A lot of people there were also affected by the war. So a lot of these communities were persecuted during the war because they were on the communist side, let's just say. And they had to flee the country and then resettle and come back. So this place has had like a really big trauma of resettlement and displacement and political activity, which has made it a target. And then you look at the other set of bubbles on the west that look like they're in San Salvador, because in San Salvador has the highest population. You also have a neighborhood called Soyapango, which is a big working class neighborhood in El Salvador that has historically been linked to a lot of MS-13. And you know, we have to look at like that these are some of the poorest neighborhoods in El Salvador, and we think about like, why is there more crime in the poorest neighborhoods of El Salvador? It's not necessarily because they're bad people, but because, you know, that's where the state has decided to neglect people, to criminalize people, and to, you know, center some of its efforts of policing.
Yeah, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolitionist geography, calls it organized abandonment, and there's been many terms for that. But yeah, when you leave people to die, they do what they got to do to stay alive. It's not always pretty either. And maybe there's something here about teaching kids too about how to use these tools, like how to make these kinds of maps or these websites. As well. Cool. Well, yeah, that's what I got for you. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to jump in on before we wrap it up?
No, I think if anything, sometimes I feel like these things I give a lot of information that could be overwhelming, especially because there's a lot of negativity in terms of like not like this is bad vibes, but like in the sense that like the people in El Salvador have gone through a lot of things, and they're going through a lot of things, but I always just like to remind people that people from El Salvador are the third largest group of Latinos in the country. We've been here a while. We contribute to communities. If you've ever had a pupusa, and if you haven't, go find one. Every major city in the U.S. probably sells pupusas somewhere. And it's good food. Try us. But also just, when I meet Salvadorans, like, part of me wants to argue with them about the president and about, like, maybe their lived reality. We may have different points of views, but it's always for me to like check myself, like I've been able to travel. I've had the privilege of having a passport and being able to go back and connect with the country, and sometimes you have to be patient with people when it comes to changing and seeing things through their point of view, and educating yourself about other people's struggles, like what you're doing here, will make us better neighbors and better community members to people who are coming into our neighborhoods who have been here since the 1980s. And I say that when I started doing this work, because I wanted to understand myself better, where I came from, what my place in the world was. And a lot of times, whatever the media says a Hispanic person is, or even Spanish language media, they never talk about El Salvador. They never talk about they talk about, countries like Mexico or something else that like doesn't really speak to me, or it's just like upper class people in a hacienda and a novella, right? So for me, doing this work, and kind of meeting people where they are in terms of like me learning from other folks, which is whether it's my elders, stuff like that, who have lived through these incredible moments of fleeing a country during a war, of having to leave in the middle of the night, having to take a journey to a different country, across different countries, because people from El Salvador migrate into Guatemala and Mexico to the United States. So it's like there's a song by Los Tigres del Norte, which is they did a really good program on Netflix at a prison. They did a concert, but Los Tigres del Norte have a song about Salvador immigrants called Tres Veces Mojados, which means 3 times a wetback. And I know it's not PC, but like it's basically a Mexican group talking about the plight of Salvador migrants, because they grew up and they kind of in Los Angeles or the Southwest or wherever they're from, they made community with Salvadoran immigrants and learned their story. And all that to say that like it wasn't until like I could talk to my grandmother, not my grandma, my mother, my father, my siblings, my aunts, my uncles, and I told them, I've studied what has happened in El Salvador, or I studied what has happened back in the home country, whether if you're from another home country, and talked about like, it must have been rough during those times. Can you tell me about like how you got through it? Like, what did you learn about yourself or humanity? Like, how did you put food on the table? How did you not go crazy? How did you get us out of danger? And educating yourself and putting yourself in other people's shoes gives you the tools to learn from people and to get like their valuable life lessons on like how they've survived. And this lesson that I've taken from Salvadoran people is something that I've taken to every part of the world where I've been to, and every workplace I've been to, and every type of person that I've met who has a different story. And we can be like, oh, okay, like more often than not, if you come from a background in the global South, if you're a person of color, if you're low income, these forces, these higher forces have played in your life in some way, and some ways to strategize during this problem is just educating ourselves about each other's sort of struggles and like where we come from.
Well said. I don't think I can follow that with anything. It's so easy to get caught up in just focusing on the terrible. So I do want to say to you that when I wrap the whole unit up, I do Haiti next, and we talk about colonialism and all that stuff. But when I come through and do cultural, we focus on the music and the food and the way that like different racializations have been approached and how they're different in the U.S. and that there is much joy and love and beauty in these things, and that's also just as valuable and necessary to talk about, coming out of this. And it's not. Don't look at your classmates just as somebody who went through this struggle, but as someone who has a great deal to offer you, like pupusas.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. What an honor and a privilege. Thank you for being here, for all the work that you do. For those of you at home watching, I'll put Daniel's socials and some of the links and materials and stuff are also in this PowerPoint here, which will be available on Teachers Pay Teachers. And I'll put your link tree and some of the other material in the description of the YouTube video as well, and how people can continue to follow your work. And this will be up on Twitter, hopefully tomorrow, this episode, or depends my work schedule. You'll see it when you see it, y'all.
Awesome, yeah, no problem. Thank you for
anything else?
Me. This was a good talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have anything to add, Daniel, before we say goodbye?
No, other than I just want to say something mean about President Bukele, but I'll just say
go for it.
You know,
let him have it.
Just question everything. Question everything. Question your elders. Question me. You know, if you think that what I said in this thing is like not okay, then go look it up yourself and find the real info. Then I want everyone to take this and challenge themselves.
Truth is out there, and they'll find it. It's definitely something you might have to dig for, but for sure. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for your time. And as always, remember that general ed kids deserve geography too. Thank you. Y'all have a good one.